Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, an actual investigation of the number of sudden cardiac deaths related to athletics and the fact that there really isn't an increase. The first ever CRISPR treatment has been approved in the UK, thereby meaning that individuals with, genetic problems are that much closer to not having a problem anymore. China's new mysterious illness is a somewhat significant cause of concern. Whether or not hunter-gatherers really did provide a better childcare, or if it's just an idyllic image of the, historical and archaeological record. The British Medical Journal, or BMJ, gets an update from Science-Based Medicine on what's happened to their, to be quite blunt about it, quality and reputation. And a update on the ozone hole, which shows that it may in fact be getting bigger and not smaller as originally hoped. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the news about athletes, and particularly those of college age. It's a study from Circulation, a peer-reviewed journal, so we can start with saying that theoretically it should be substantiated, and it is largely conducted by doctors. Again, this isn't any guarantee of quality, but it is at least a good place to start. They looked at data from 2002 through to 2022, so a 20-year time period, although only results from 4 independent databases, which is a slight concern, but nonetheless. The search over that time frame found 143 cases of sudden cardiac death in college-aged athletes. This was a 143 sample out of 1,102 total deaths that they identified. Therefore, this is a roughly 10% subset. The other 90% was composed of various other issues, such as sports injuries. When they broke down the results here, they found that over that 20-year time frame, there really wasn't any increase in the number of sudden cardiac deaths. And this would be things like blood clots, heart attacks, so on. In fact, they found that the number was decreasing. However, there is an exception to their findings, and basically it means that if you're a professional basketball player, you are screwed. If you are male, black, or play basketball, there's a high incidence. Yeah. As said, if you play basketball professionally, you may want to take more care of your heart. Of course, a lot of this is not necessarily something you can do anything about. Often the issues associated with this are either congenital or completely undetected until something happens, and it's simply an unfortunate nature of life. Well, in this case, death. Going on to something you can avoid and do something about, we have DIY fecal transplants. Yeah. People have thought, oh yay, it's a great idea, let's take a dose of someone else's poop, and it'll make us better, not understanding that feces, no matter who it's from, is one of the primary ways of getting things like gastroenteritis, inflammation of the GI tract, food poisoning, and so on. Yeah. While this is no means as harmful as those individuals who think taking cyanide will cure them all their ailments, it's also something that won't kill them immediately, therefore they're going to keep doing it. The reason this is happening is anecdotes. And no, anecdotes are not data. In fact, they're not really useful for anything. Individually, an anecdote is basically someone saying, oh yeah, this is what I remember. Collectively, maybe, but even then, an anecdote is not really useful. A qualitative analysis of recollections of these sorts of things could prove useful, but that's because it's done systematically. Most anecdotes do not fall under that category. Now, to be very clear about this, there is some evidence that fecal transplants can be useful, but to be very, very explicit about it, it is preliminary, it is inconsistent, and it is only for a certain number of conditions. It's not a panacea. What is the problem here? The bullshit these people are spreading is literally being consumed in the form of human shit. Bad jokes aside, the roots of this really aren't very strong, very wide, or very deep. It's just like the genetics of most of the people who are trying to evangelize it. It's a very shallow pool rather than a deep ocean. And so, when individuals start relying on online instructions on how to prepare their own preparations, they're often, to be quite blunt about this, messing things up and creating an absolute disaster in the making. It's not just that you'll have, individuals getting ill, but the idea is that they may be spreading a particularly nasty pathogenic bacterium between each other, notably if they are resistant bacterium. This can be the case if individuals who have had digestive issues and had to have antibiotics repeatedly end up finding themselves cured miraculously, most likely through pure coincidence, and in turn then spread their feces to others in an attempt to share the love. Well, a love of food poisoning anyway. Shifting to a treatment that actually does do something, we have the UK approving a CRISPR treatment for both sickle cell anemia and for transfusion-dependent beta thalassemia. Now, these are the two distinct conditions, but thankfully both of them appear to be treatable with the same, let's call it, gene therapy. It's Cascavy. This is a treatment, as mentioned, and the idea is to permanently alter the genome so that individuals who have for this instance, the sickle cell gene or the TDT gene, no longer have that particularly mutated version, but instead the normal functioning version. The reason this works so clearly for both disorders, despite being a single treatment, is that it is, although different places of the hemoglobin molecule, are both based in hemoglobin. So if you target the whole gene, you both treat sickle cell anemia and beta thalassemia. This resolves both conditions and means one drug, or in this case one gene therapy, can be approved to deal with multiple disorders. It is worth us pointing out that although this gene therapy does work, it is not perfect. It's nearly perfect, but not quite. 28 out of the 29 patients with sickle cell anemia appear to have had their condition largely resolved, and 39 of 42 patients with TDT had their condition resolved. So we're not going to have any, weird cat girls showing up with genetic modifications. But at the same time, it's also needing a little more work to be tweaked to get it just right. The other advantage to this over, other, let's call them conventional treatments, as they're used now, largely things like blood transfusions, are that this is a one-off treatment. As a result, you no longer need to rely on regular blood transfusions for sickle cell anemia. This, to be blunt about it, treatment, and since it is a single treatment, it does come with a very large caveat, and that's the bill for it. In the UK, it's going to cost about £1 million, which roughly corresponds to $2 million US, which is roughly what it does cost in the USA for a similar treatment, which arguably would make it prohibitive in the USA because, you would need to sell your kidney, your partner's kidney, your kid's kidneys, and probably your dog's kidney in order to be able to afford it, and, most people aren't inclined to do so. The cost for it, though, is more efficient, or more effective, arguably due to the fact that individuals, for say, example, a sickle cell anemia, aren't required to attend hospital on a regular basis, get regular treatment, get blood, and so on, all of which would be adding to their cost, and so the earlier they're given this genetic treatment, the longer the savings add up. This means that although incredibly expensive, at least in the UK, it is still relatively cost-effective, and it certainly improves the quality of life of those individuals with those conditions. And next we have, what is, to be quite blunt, news that shouldn't surprise anybody, although this should be taken with a lot of salt, or perhaps we should say skepticism, because it's all about conspiracy theories and just who believes in them. Now, to be honest, the findings are purely correlations, and they seem to be rather scattered correlations, but nonetheless, they tell us something more than what we otherwise had. First of all, those who are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories either suffer from paranoia, schizotypy, narcissism, are religious or spiritual, have a low cognitive ability, at least relative to others, are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories because of this, and overall tend to be, let's say, more on the fringes of society. When the researchers who were doing this, research, looked into it, they found that, surprisingly, there was little bias to the results. The key here, however, is that they weren't studying individual, research. This was a meta-analysis, and because of that, they're taking all the research that exists and aggregating it together. Now, as we've mentioned, there are certain concerns, one of which is just how many correlations they've found. And it does seem like, when you examine the correlations, there are too many for this research to be relied on extensively. It's more like a starting point, where you could follow individual, let's call them lines of evidence, or you could, if you so wish, call them conspiracy theories, to their inevitable end. At the moment, the most likely lines of evidence to be investigated are those that are correlations between conspiracy theories and religion, which had a fairly strong indicator, and the Big Five personality traits, which also had a strong indicator. Adding fuel to the fire of all conspiracy theorists out there is a new respiratory illness in China. Yeah. This time at least we know about it relatively soon after it started spreading. Relatively. Not only that, but, it is an unknown illness, and primarily affecting children, which is unexpected as a rule. Children tend to not be as affected by respiratory illnesses in terms of this compared to, adults, but they are more vulnerable in certain respects. The disease started spreading around the 21st of November, so given the date of this video, it's about 6 days before publication. This is substantially better than the weeks, if not arguably months, that China waited to make the world aware of COVID-19. The condition itself primarily consists of symptoms like shortness of breath and pneumonia. Pneumonia just being inflammation of the lungs, which is generally a result of some sort of pathogen causing an immunological reaction. This also has the effect of resulting in coughing, shortness of breath, fever, and rather obviously chest pain. The big caveat to these findings is that there are radiological results, and those radiological results show that about 1/3 of the individuals in question, primarily children, have a mass in their lungs, and the mass is indicative of a bacterial infection rather than a viral infection. This would indicate that, for some reason, the children have become vulnerable to a bacterial infection, which is what's causing some of their current symptoms. Likely following a viral infection. For example, if they had had COVID-19, as a result their immune system is somewhat beaten and battered, the bacteria finds their way into the lung, and in that opportunistic moment, when the immune system is weakened, sets up home. Unfortunately, not a home that you want to have, but nonetheless. The benefit of it being bacterial, if that is the case, and that is a very big if, is that bacteria, for the most part, can be treated with antibiotics, whereas viruses are much harder to deal with. This means that if it is a bacterial issue, we can handle it. If it's not, we might have a new COVID strain on our hands. But we don't have enough information yet, and, China is less than forthcoming most of the time, and more so with regards to this. In other news, to excite the conspiracy theorists, we have a mysterious illness spreading in dogs in the USA. Much like the Chinese pets, we mean children, this is another respiratory illness, and it's affecting hundreds of dogs across the United States of America, which is a consideration. The fact that this is showing up across multiple states in the USA, including Oregon, Colorado, Illinois, New Hampshire, and Nevada, means that it does need to be taken more seriously. The symptoms are relatively similar to kennel cough. It includes nasal discharge, fever, lethargy, loss of appetite, coughing, and a relatively long time frame compared to most illnesses. It's somewhere up to 8 weeks, although often a little bit less. Thankfully, dogs seem to be able to resolve it themselves, but it can lead to pneumonia, which is an issue, largely because it can screw with the dog's lungs, but also it can kill them, which, given that they're dogs, we don't want to see them dying. Dogs are good. Dogs are unlike cats. Cats are assholes. Well, the worry here is, well, twofold. First of all, we don't know if it's bacterial or if it's viral. Given the spread, viral does seem more likely. And there's the second element to this, which is antibiotics don't appear to be working. This would mean one of two things. Either it is viral, or, somewhat more disconcertingly, that it is a bacteria that has antibiotic resistance. Either way, without knowing what it is, treatment and, to a certain extent, control and containment of this outbreak is very hard to achieve. Because we don't know what's causing it, how it's spread or similar, it's, as I said, rather hard to contain, which has led to the rather direct advice of you don't need to worry about it for the most part, as fully vaccinated and healthy dogs have almost no risks associated with infection. But if you are worried, well, just do what we did during COVID, which is avoid crowded places, gatherings, and similar. Although in this case, rather than people, you want to avoid other dogs. Shifting to news that's in a completely different line of thought, hunter-gatherers and childcare, and it's a blog post from the Neurologica blog. The gist of it is, well, what is natural, and is it better to have a, community-based childcare or child-raising environment and system? Arguably, this is based on the somewhat erroneous concept that hunter-gatherers have a better approach to raising children given that it is communal. That is, multiple adults take responsibility for the children in terms of the village, while others are out hunting for their food. This is fundamentally built on the concept of this is what our ancestors did and we survived, therefore it worked. That of course ignores the fact that we survived by breeding like rabbits and trying to produce as many children as possible so as to overcome nature's attempt to kill us off. There is a reason why, if you look at the human population throughout history, you will see that only in the last few hundred years where we've begun to industrialize and be able to produce food on a massive scale, ensure consistency of that food supply, ensure housing and all the other developments in modern medicine, that the population has increased the way it has. That is one reason why it is ridiculous to try and compare the modern lifestyle and claim that it's worse than what we did long ago. Simply because, well, humanity hasn't really been relying on the same standard of living for that much time. The research that's stimulated this fundamentally looked at a tribe living in Africa. They are the, and we're likely going to butcher this, the Mbenye Bayaka hunter-gatherers from the Republic of the Congo. And they, have a hunter-gatherer society as given. What they looked at was the people who attended to child's needs and who they actually were and whether or not they were the direct parents of said child. What they found is about half of all of the care and attention given to these children was from non-biological parents, and this was from a network of 10 or more and up to 20 individuals. This ranged from older children, teenagers, and even adult relatives. Also during the night, when the children cried, about half of the time, someone other than a direct parent was responsible for attending to the child's needs. And this leads to the gist of what's been found, that is that communal rearing of children has these benefits, particularly for the parent, given that, being constantly woken throughout the night is one of the joys associated with children. The authors themselves, though, do note that, don't take this with too much significance, as the implications don't necessarily translate, largely because, a modern, particularly Western society, doesn't live in a village setting, and therefore we now rely more on childcare during the day and parents during the night. They do point out, however, that those who have, say, in-laws or their parents living with them may see some of these same benefits, not necessarily the same, but some. Shifting from sociological and anthropological studies to academia, we need to focus on, the role of things like ChatGPT and, publications. In this case, thankfully not an actual publication, but a study of what would happen if you did try to publish using results from ChatGPT. The researchers asked it to generate a database, and this is a big problem, largely because that database was not able to be identified as being fraudulent without forensic investigation. And yeah, you literally could not look at this as most, reviewers would, and know that the data was fake. You actually had to go through it and establish very carefully whether or not there was, mismatched data sets, numbers weren't lining up, and so on. You have to very systematically and very carefully look at what's going on. Arguably, this is one of the, more terrifying prospects with AI, that they could start producing fraudulent or distorted data, and thereby slowly nudge humanity in one direction or the other. The example in question asked ChatGPT to generate two datasets. Well, effectively one dataset but two groups. And it's all about a surgical treatment and to assert that one was better than the other. The upside to this is that at least the research itself did appear to fail when using a protocol designed to check for authenticity and reliability of the data. So there is a means available, or at least a way, to be able to figure out whether or not ChatGPT has been involved in other publications. But it is worth noting that this process is much more intensive, and as such, it's a concern. Ironically, however, the same team responsible for this publication are also the same team trying to develop a tool to try and be able to just as easily identify whether or not data has been created by manipulation, or in this case, something like ChatGPT and AI. Shifting to other academia news, and something of a criticism, well, not something, it's an outright criticism, of the British Medical Journal, or BMJ. This is previously a very reputable and well-respected journal. It was, known to publish many different things that have been the stalwart bases of various, major achievements in life. However, it's also the same journal that's published work supporting Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop. So, yeah. Starting with its, let's call it prestigious achievements, one of which was simply a takedown piece for Andrew Wakefield, showing that his work on the MMR vaccine was just bullshit, which should be no surprise to anyone given what happened to Wakefield after that fact. But since then, they've begun publishing more and more, let's call them dubious and contentious research. For example, the Paul Thacker report on COVID-19 claiming integrity issues with Pfizer's vaccine trials. A publication that was effectively eviscerated by those who could read what was going on and understand that it was trying to extrapolate out a lot of information from a single site to many, many more than one site. Most recently, there's been yet another Vaccine Adverse Events Report System, or VAERS, publication claiming that anecdotal data leads to vaccines being bad for people. Vaccines are one of the most effective health interventions humanity has ever made. Arguably only slightly worse than something like, say, fluoride in water, and only because fluoride in water is so much easier to deliver and produce, along with a few other benefits. Because of this study, which relied on anecdotes and left out very critical information, it presented a broken system that didn't actually exist. The science-based medicine blog goes through in great detail not just some of the history, but, some of the fall from fame and prestige that the BMJ has experienced in recent years. And you can read it in great detail here. We're certainly not going to read it to you, as you're unlikely to be a child watching this video. Shifting to astronomical news, and something the History Channel will be truly excited to see, messages arriving to Earth from somewhere out in space, and at this stage, no, it's not aliens. It is in fact a demonstration from NASA that we can, to an extent, extend the internet beyond Earth and arguably create what is practically interstellar communication. This is done by sending a laser signal more than 16 million kilometers or 10 million freedom units, roughly 40 times the distance between Earth and the Moon. The achievement of this technology, so to say, is twofold. One is the simple distance between the satellite sending a signal to Earth and receiving it, but also the kind of signal being sent. Most communication of this kind relies on radio waves. Now, these work just fine, but they do have an upper limit on how much data they can send at any given time. By using infrared, they're able to do exactly the same thing, but that infrared light, or near infrared, in this case, is able to send much more data, and that's what they've tested here. Are you able to get what is effectively high-capacity bandwidth, something that can send extremely high-quality video or data at one time? The advantages of this over radio waves are that, well, radio waves are just that, a wave. They're sent out in a relatively broad front, and they just keep going until they hit their target that receives them. The use of a laser, and particularly a near-infrared laser, means that they can send a very tiny beam that doesn't require anywhere near as much power, and it also means that you can have multiple arrays operating out of the same relatively narrow area without interfering with each other. But given that, well, to travel as far as these signals have in about 50 seconds, it is a significant improvement. It does, however, raise certain concerns given the sheer distance between the laser sending the signal and the satellite receiving it. There is possibility of, well, interruptions. For example, space debris, destroyed or decommissioned satellites, asteroids, and so on. So these are all concerns that would need to be addressed in future work. There's also the problem of rather high-tech and, to be quite blunt about it, quite expensive and ridiculously difficult to make equipment required to be able to both send and receive the signals. The final news we have for you is all about the atmosphere and specifically the ozone layer within it. There has been the general view that since we stopped using CFC or similar products that were damaging the ozone layer, that it has been gradually closing over. This is ideal, as the rather large hole in the ozone layer allowed for more heat to penetrate through to Earth and various issues to do with sunlight. But a publication from Nature shows that this may not be the case. Now, we will be clear about this. The publication is going against the general consensus in research circles that the ozone layer hole has been steadily recovering. But, well, this is the question here. What difference they've found versus what other researchers believe is happening. Their findings can be summarized this way. Between 2004 and 2022, they found that although the ozone hole recovered so much in its size, the density of ozone within it went down, at least compared to 19 years ago, and that decrease was somewhere around 26%. This leads them to estimate that it is approximately twice the size of Antarctica, and that it is larger than it was 3 years prior to them reading it, at least as the month of their publication. The researchers do agree that stopping CFCs was a successful approach to resolving this, but they also can't exactly explain why there has been the change that has occurred. They believe it may have something to do with the Antarctic polar vortex, but they can't establish a link between this and the change in the ozone layer. As such, it's, well, to be blunt about it, kind of like saying that we found these numbers, but we can't explain how we got them. Most of the time, that research will be laughed out, and to an extent, that's kind of what's happening. Although, yes, it is true that researchers have genuinely recognized the research is being conducted correctly, they also question the findings because it can't be explained. An important consideration when you're looking at something like the ozone layer, and particularly the ozone hole, which can vary drastically year from year. This means looking at it on a day-to-day or month-to-month basis, like these researchers have, could also be a problem. they may be looking at those variations and going, yeah, we've found this particular variability here. Then somebody looks at the same data over that 19-year time frame and measures between the start point and the end point, finding that actually there was no change. There was just variation in the middle. And that's the key here, and fundamentally why the study is being criticized. It's not using long-term data, as it's only 19 to 22 years of data, and to an extent, it's looking at it at a too narrow a scale. Then again, it's also true that, well, we don't know a lot about how the atmosphere works in some respects. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.